At 3 in the morning, the old cottage on Royal Terrace holds a particular kind of quiet that Malcolm Harrington has learned to read, the way a sailor reads the sky. Not peaceful, not empty, something waiting. When the mobile phone on his bedside table shuddered against the wood at exactly 2 minutes past 3, he was already half awake, because the house had been speaking to him all night in the language of wind, off the Otago Peninsula, and rain tapping the iron roof like a man who cannot decide whether to come inside. He reached for the phone in the dark, with the practiced calm of a man who spent 40 years working marine electrical systems, and learned long ago that the hour of a call tells you more than the words do. The screen showed one name: Ethan. Only one person in this world would call at this hour: his grandson. He answered before the second vibration finished. The connection came through badly, cut by weather and distance, and whatever hill stood between the signal and wherever Ethan was at that moment, somewhere out on the South Island roads, coming back from a job. The voice was unmistakable but stripped of its usual warmth, pressed down into something careful and deliberate, the voice of a young man choosing every word with precision. "Granddad, whatever you do, don't turn on the kitchen light." Malcolm sat up in the dark. 76 years old, and his back reminded him of it, but he sat up straight and fast, because that voice was a voice he trusted more completely than he trusted the floor under his feet, or the walls around him, or the stars outside if they had been visible through the cloud. "What is it? What has happened? Promise me first." He opened his mouth to ask another question, and the line went dead. Not a gradual fade, a clean cut, the way a wire parts when the tension finally overcomes the copper. Silence. The old wall clock on the landing ticked. Rain moved against the windows in one long breath, and then held still. Malcolm sat in the dark with the phone warm in his hand, and the particular silence of a house that has just asked you a question you do not yet know how to answer. Let me stop right here for just a moment, because I need you to understand something before I go on. I do not tell this story often. I am not, by nature, a man who talks about the things that have moved him most. My generation was not built for that kind of openness. We were built for showing up and keeping quiet and fixing what needed fixing and not making a fuss about any of it. But I am telling this one. I am telling it because I think somebody out there in the dark tonight needs to hear it. So before I go further, do me a favor. Tell me where you are listening from. What city? What country? What corner of the world? Drop it in the comments, and I promise I read everyone. And if it is late where you are, tell me that too. Because this is a story best told after midnight, when the house is quiet and you have time to sit with it. Leave a like if you are with me so far. Subscribe if you want another one tomorrow, because there is a new story here every single day. All right, let me take you back to that bedroom in the dark. Malcolm Harrington has lived alone in the restored cottage on Royal Terrace for 7 years, which is how long it has been since his wife Margaret passed. And the aloneness is something he has made his peace with in the way you make your peace with weather. You do not enjoy it exactly. You learn its rhythms. You build your days around it. He is 76 years old, which in his own accounting means he has been alive long enough to have made every mistake worth making, and to have learned, through the slow accumulation of consequences, roughly where wisdom lives. He woke each morning at 6, because the body learns what the work demands, and does not let go of the lesson, even when the work is done. Coffee first, black, in a cup Margaret bought at a market in Christchurch years ago, that he has never replaced even though the glaze is cracking along one side. Then the radio, the local station, nothing loud. Then a walk down toward the harbor if the weather permitted, which in Dunedin is roughly half the year and gloriously so, the kind of coastal light in autumn that makes a man feel that the world was designed with care, and somebody who loved him put this particular view here specifically for him to find it. He had been a marine electrician for the whole of his working life, which in practical terms meant that he understood how systems fail, not the drama of failure, the quiet accumulation of small neglects that lead, eventually, to the moment when something that should have held gives way. He learned this working on fishing vessels and cargo ships out of Port Chalmers, getting his hands into wiring that had not been looked at in 20 years, finding the places where moisture had done its patient work, where insulation had brittled, where a connection that looked solid was holding by 3 strands of copper and a prayer. He learned to see what people preferred not to see, which is that things do not last on their own. Things last because someone pays attention, someone makes the round, someone does the unglamorous work of checking the thing that looks fine from the outside. Margaret used to say he worried too much. He would say he worried exactly the right amount. She would laugh and put her hand on his arm, and that was usually the end of the argument. The cottage on Royal Terrace is not large, but it has always been sufficient. 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, a kitchen that opens to a small garden on the slope, and a view from the upper window that sweeps across the rooftops of North Dunedin toward the harbor and, on a clear day, to the hills beyond. He restored it himself over a period of years, or restored as much of it as one man in his 60s could manage, and hired good tradesmen for the rest. He knew what good work looked like, and he did not accept anything less. The floorboards were original kauri, sanded and sealed. The weatherboards outside were repainted every 4 years, whether they needed it or not, because the Dunedin coast is hard on paint and hardest on the places where paint is allowed to fail. Every light switch in the house was replaced when he moved in, because the originals were original in the wrong sense, 50 years old and wired by someone who had been in a hurry. He tested every circuit himself before he was satisfied. Old habits from 40 years of understanding what happens when the sea gets into the wrong places. He sat in the dark now and did not turn on any light, because he had made no promise, but he felt the shape of a promise without the words, the same way you feel a current in still water. Something Ethan knew, something Ethan had seen. The boy, and he still called him the boy in his own mind. Though Ethan was 29 and a foot taller than Malcolm and had shoulders like a man who spent his working life climbing buildings, had never asked Malcolm for anything trivial. Not once. He did not call at 3 a.m. for nothing. He did not speak in that careful, deliberate tone, unless there was something real underneath it. Malcolm sat with the phone in his hand and did not move toward the kitchen. The rain had settled into a steady pattern against the roof, the kind of rain that comes in off the coast with real intention behind it, not a shower but a commitment. The window above the landing was showing him nothing but darkness and moving water. Somewhere out there, Ethan was on a road with bad mobile coverage, and a problem Malcolm did not yet understand, and Malcolm was sitting in his bedroom in the dark, because he trusted the boy more than he trusted his own curiosity. He had earned that trust over 29 years. He had been there the day Ethan was born, driving his daughter Carol to Dunedin Hospital in weather not entirely different from tonight's, gripping the steering wheel of his old Holden with the particular focus of a man who understands that some drives cannot afford a mistake. He had been there through the years that followed, the Sunday visits, the school holiday weeks, the teenager who discovered he was better with numbers and structures than with people, and who found in Malcolm's company a man who did not require him to be anything other than what he was. Ethan had spent 3 summers as a teenager following Malcolm around the cottage and asking questions about how wiring worked, how you traced a fault, how you knew where the problem was when the problem was hidden inside a wall. Malcolm had answered every question seriously, because he believed the only way to treat a young person's curiosity was seriously, and he remembered being young himself and knowing the sting of having his questions dismissed as too small for a grown person's time. That boy had grown into someone Malcolm looked at and felt something he could not always name, something beyond pride, something quieter and more fundamental than pride, the sense that a piece of the world had turned out well and that he had played some small part in it. He sat in the dark and waited. The clock on the landing said 12 minutes past 3. He tried calling back. The call failed. He tried again. Nothing. The storm was doing what storms on the Otago coast do, which is take the infrastructure personally and dismantle it piece by piece. He set the phone on the bedside table and settled back against the headboard and turned his mind to the facts, because that was what 40 years of electrical fault tracing had taught him. When you do not know what is wrong, you begin with what you know. He knew the cottage. He knew every circuit, or had known them thoroughly 7 years ago, and had watched them carefully since. He knew the kitchen circuit ran off a board in the hallway, and that the exterior junction box on the north wall, the one that served the outside light and connected back through to the kitchen circuit, had been installed in the original renovation, and was older than he would choose for a coastal property. He had noted it twice in his own mental catalog, and told himself each time that he would attend to it when he had the right materials to hand. He had not yet attended to it. He sat with that knowledge in the dark. The rain had not let up. He did not turn on the kitchen light. If you are still with me at this point, I want to ask you something before I go on, because we are just coming to the part where this story turns into something I did not expect it to be. Have you ever received a call that changed the way you understood someone you loved? Not a dramatic call. Not bad news, exactly. Just a call that made you see something you had been looking at for years without actually seeing it. Write to me in the comments if you have. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me what time it is there. And if somebody in your life has ever done something quietly for you, something you only found out about later, tell me that too, because that is what this story is really about, and I want to know if it is reaching you. Leave a like. Subscribe if you have not. There is a new story here every single day, and some of them are going to find you at exactly the right moment. Malcolm Harrington was born in 1948, which makes him a child of the post-war years in New Zealand, a time when this country was still wearing the particular seriousness of a place that had sent a great many of its young men away and received some of them back changed and some of them not at all. His father had been a merchant seaman, absent for long stretches and present in the particular intense way of men who know their time is measured. His mother had run the household with the precise economy of a woman who understood that resources were not infinite and that waste was a kind of disrespect to the effort that produced things. Malcolm had grown up in Port Chalmers, in a weatherboard house close enough to the water that he could smell the tide from his bedroom window, and the sea had entered his sense of the world so early and so thoroughly that he could not imagine himself as someone who lived far from it. When he completed his apprenticeship and received his marine electrical license, it felt less like an achievement than a homecoming, a confirmation of something the harbor had always told him about himself. He had been a careful man his whole life, careful with money, careful with words, careful with promises. He made very few promises because he intended to keep everyone he made. He had promised Margaret a life in Dunedin, and he had kept it. He had promised his daughter Carol that whatever happened, she could call him, and she had called him from difficult places, and he had come. He had promised himself, one morning in the early 1990s when something had happened at work that he still did not discuss, that he would pay attention, that he would not be the man who looked away because looking was uncomfortable. The thing from the 90s was this, and he told it rarely because it still tightened something in his chest. He had been working with a crew on a fishing vessel out of Port Chalmers, a rewiring job on an older boat, and one of the younger men on the crew, a quiet fellow named Terry who kept to himself and did his work well, had mentioned twice in passing that something felt off about one of the panels they were replacing. Malcolm had been busy and tired and behind on the timeline, and he had said each time that they would check it again when they had the section complete. They finished the section. They moved to the next. 3 weeks later, the vessel had an electrical fire in that panel at sea. No one died. Terry was not on that voyage, but the panel burned because of exactly what Terry had noticed, and Malcolm had deferred, a connection that looked correct, but was not seated properly, and had been generating heat with every cycle. Malcolm had stood in the Port Chalmers yard looking at the burned casing, and understood something about himself that he carried from that day forward, like a stone in his pocket. When someone who knows things tells you something is wrong, you stop, you listen, you check. He had never again let a schedule or a tiredness override that understanding. It was why, at 12 minutes past 3 on a stormy autumn morning in Dunedin, he was sitting in the dark in his bedroom instead of walking to the kitchen to make a cup of something warm. Because Ethan knew things. Ethan had spent 7 years as a structural surveyor, crawling through the bones of old buildings on the South Island, reading the language of timber and stone and aging infrastructure, learning where the failures hid before they became catastrophes. He had his grandfather's eyes for concealed problems, the patience to look past the surface to where the real story was, and he had added to it a professional training that Malcolm respected completely. If Ethan said, "Do not turn on the kitchen light," there was a reason, and the reason was real, and Malcolm was going to sit in the dark until he understood what it was. He fell into something that was not quite sleep and not quite waking, a suspension between the two that old men know well, where the mind is present but not pressing, where you can observe your own thoughts without being carried by them. He thought about Margaret. He often did, in these middle hours, not with grief exactly, or not only with grief, but with the particular quality of missing that comes when something has been part of the structure of your life for so long that its absence does not feel like loss, but like a change in the air pressure, a difference in the way the house breathes. She had loved this kitchen. She had loved the window above the sink that looked out onto the garden and the slope beyond. She had made her bread on the counter below that window on Sunday mornings while the radio played, and the smell of that bread had become part of Malcolm's understanding of what home meant. He did not turn on the kitchen light. The clock said 20 to 4. Outside, the storm was beginning its slow conversation with the ridgeline, that particular sound of wind finding the angles of a roof and testing each one with the systematic patience of something that has all night and knows it. Malcolm listened to the house the way you listen to an old friend, hearing not just the words but the gaps between them. The roof sounded solid. The walls were not speaking with any urgency. The water that had been tapping at the windows earlier had settled into the steady percussion of proper rain. Whatever Ethan had seen or known, the house itself seemed to be holding. He picked up the phone again at 4 in the morning and tried once more. This time it rang 3 times before the network gave up. He set it down. He thought about the junction box on the north wall. He thought about the way moisture traveled through old wiring, the patient infiltration of it, the way it worked against insulation at the molecular level, until the insulation was something that only looked like insulation, that would hold until it did not. He had seen it happen on boats. He had seen it happen in buildings. He had spent 40 years learning to see it before it became an event. He sat in the dark and felt, in a way he would not have expected, entirely at peace. Because Ethan had called. Whatever the problem was, Ethan had seen it first. The electricians arrived at 8:30 the following morning, 2 men from a company in South Dunedin that Ethan had already telephoned before he called Malcolm back at 6:15, when the storm had thinned enough for a signal to pass through. The call at 6:15 lasted 4 minutes, and Ethan spoke in that same careful way, only now there was something else underneath it, a tiredness, and also something that sounded like relief, the specific texture of relief that belongs to a person who has been carrying a worry for hours and is now beginning to set it down. He explained it methodically. He had been driving back from an inspection job in Middlemarch late the night before, taking the Strath-Tyeri road that comes down through the hills east of the city, when his phone had received a notification from the smart home monitoring system he had installed at the cottage 6 months ago. Malcolm knew about the monitoring system because Ethan had shown it to him and explained what it did, and Malcolm had said it seemed like a great deal of fuss for a man who had been managing his own home for 30 years. Ethan had nodded and set it up anyway. The notification flagged an anomaly in the power readings from the kitchen circuit, the kind of fluctuation that could indicate a fault developing somewhere in the line. Ethan had pulled over on the Middlemarch Road in the dark and looked at the remote feed from the small camera he had also installed, without particular announcement, above the garage door. The camera could not see inside the house, but it could see the exterior north wall, and what Ethan saw on that wall, in the screen of his phone at 2:30 in the morning in the hills above Dunedin, was water running down the junction box casing in a way that told him, from professional experience, that the seal on that box had failed. He called his contact at the electrical company and got voicemail. He called the after-hours line and was placed in a queue. He tried Malcolm and the signal dropped after the first connection. He drove the remaining 20 minutes to the edge of the city where the signal steadied and found that he had enough for one clear sentence, one instruction, the single most important thing he needed Malcolm to know before the signal failed again. He said it and the line dropped. Malcolm listened to all of this standing in his kitchen in the morning light, not touching the light switch, looking at the junction box through the window, the same way he had looked at burned panels in Port Chalmers years ago, with the eyes of someone who understands what a near thing looks like. The electricians arrived and confirmed what Ethan had described. The seal had failed sometime in the previous weeks, probably during an earlier rain event that had not been as severe as last night's. Water had been entering the box and pooling against the wiring. The morning storm had pushed enough volume into the system that switching on the kitchen circuit at the wrong moment would have created a serious fault in the old wiring between the box and the kitchen distribution point. Not a fire, necessarily, but a tripped system at best and something considerably worse at worst. In a 76-year-old man's house in the middle of the night, either possibility carried weight. The electricians replaced the junction box, upgraded the seal, inspected the run of cable between the exterior and the kitchen, found 2 additional sections they did not like the look of, replaced those as well, and presented Malcolm with a written report by 11 in the morning. He stood in the kitchen reading it, while the coffee maker finished its cycle and felt the particular settling that comes when a thing that might have been bad has been prevented from being bad. Before I go further, let me pause here for a moment and tell you something. I have sat with this story for a long time before I told it, not because it is complicated, but because the thing it taught me is not something I have an easy word for. And I want to know if you understand what I mean before I get to the part that broke me open a little. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had someone quietly fix something in your life before you even knew it was broken? Not dramatically, not with announcement, just quietly, because they were paying attention and they cared enough to act on what they noticed. Write it down. Where are you listening from? What is the time where you are? And subscribe if you have not yet, because the next part of this story is the one I have been building toward, and you should not miss it. Leave a like if you are still here. Every single one of them tells me to keep going. The folder was on the kitchen table by the time the electricians left. It had been in the bottom of the filing drawer in the spare bedroom, which Malcolm used as an office, behind a row of folders containing his own records, rates notices and insurance documents, and the original plans for the cottage restoration filed in a red folder he had labeled clearly in the way of a man who distrusted his own memory less than he distrusted the world's tendency to move things. This folder was not one he had made. It was thicker than it had any right to be. The cover was a plain buff color without a label, and when he opened it on the kitchen table, he found inside a set of documents that he had to read twice before he understood what he was looking at. The oldest document in the folder was a report dated 4 years and 3 months ago. It was from a roofing company in Dunedin, and it described an inspection of the iron roof of a property on Royal Terrace, his property, the cottage, his home, and it outlined repairs carried out to the ridge capping on the south slope, and to 3 sections of flashing around the chimney that had developed gaps insufficient to be seen from the ground, but sufficient, in the opinion of the inspector, to admit water into the roof space under sustained rainfall. The repairs were listed. The cost was listed. The invoice was attached to the report with a paperclip. The invoice was addressed to Ethan Harrington, with a Dunedin post office box for the billing address that Malcolm had never seen before and did not recognize. He turned the page. The next document was a service record from a heating company, dated 2 years and 8 months ago. It described the annual service of the heat pump in the main bedroom and the replacement of a part in the compressor unit that the technician had flagged as likely to fail within the coming winter. The work was completed. The replacement part was noted. The invoice was addressed to Ethan Harrington at the same post office box. Malcolm sat down. He had not sat down because he needed to. He sat down because his legs made the decision before his mind caught up with them, the way a body sometimes knows the weight of a thing, before the conscious mind has finished adding it up. He kept reading. There was a report from a plumber 3 years ago describing the inspection and resealing of the bathroom waste connections under the floor, work that Ethan had apparently arranged during a week when Malcolm had been visiting his sister in Timaru for a family occasion. The plumber's notes described the original seals as dried and brittle, and noted that without intervention, they would have failed within a year, likely introducing water damage into the subfloor. The repairs had taken a day and a half. Malcolm had returned from Timaru to a perfectly ordinary house and had not noticed a thing different. There was a record from an electrician, not last night's company, but a different one, dating back 5 years, describing the replacement of 3 power points in the kitchen that had shown signs of heat damage inside the housing, invisible from the front, detectable only if you opened them and looked. The power points were the originals from the Restoration era, and the heat damage was consistent with connections that had loosened over time and been arcing intermittently. The electrician's note said the points had been in service for approximately 30 years, and that arc faults of this type were a known fire risk in older wiring of this vintage. Replaced. Work completed. Invoice to Ethan Harrington. There was a record from a garden maintenance company 2 years ago describing the removal and treatment of a section of weatherboard on the north face of the cottage, the same north face that contained the junction box, where the original paint had been concealing a softening in the timber beneath that indicated early moisture damage. The board had been replaced with a matching section, primed and painted, and the surrounding area had been treated. Malcolm had noticed the repair, or the patch of slightly brighter paint, and had assumed Margaret's sister had arranged it, because she sometimes organized things without telling him. He had intended to ask her about it, and had forgotten. He sat at the kitchen table in the pale morning light, with the folder open in front of him, and the coffee going cold in the cup beside him, and he read every document in the folder. There were 14 in total. They covered a period of 6 years. They described, collectively, every significant maintenance issue that this cottage had developed in that time, every aging component, every failing seal, every section of cable or pipe or timber that had been approaching the end of its reliable service life, quietly identified, quietly arranged, quietly paid for, and quietly completed while Malcolm was elsewhere, or simply not paying attention, because he trusted his own assessment that everything was still working just fine. He closed the folder and set his hands flat on the table. He is 29 years old. He has been doing this since he was 23, since the year he qualified and started working and started earning a real wage, and made what Malcolm was only now understanding had been a private and completely unannounced decision about what some part of that wage was for. He had not told Malcolm. He had not hinted at it. He had never once, in any of the Sunday visits or the phone calls or the shared breakfasts overlooking the harbor, made any reference to any of it. He had fixed the things that needed fixing, and he had done it in the way Malcolm himself had always worked, without fuss, without announcement, without wanting credit for what was simply the correct response to a problem that needed solving. Malcolm sat with that. He sat with it for a long time. Let me stop here, because I have to. Not for long. But this part is not easy to move through quickly. If you have somebody in your life who does things like this for you, quietly, without telling you, I want you to write their name in the comments. Just a first name. That is all. Because they deserve to be said out loud somewhere, even by a stranger. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me what time it is there. And if you are watching this alone, know that you are not alone in having felt exactly what I felt sitting at that table. Subscribe. Leave a like. There is a new story here tomorrow, and every day after. But take a moment right now and think about who in your life deserves to have their name said. The phone rang at 10:30. Ethan's name on the screen. Malcolm answered, and they talked for 40 minutes, which was unusually long for them both, because they were not, either of them, men of many words. Ethan had slept for a few hours after the morning's calls and arrangements, and was speaking with his ordinary voice now. The tiredness mostly cleared, the relief more settled. Malcolm asked him about the folder. There was a pause on the line, not a guilty pause, a considering one, the pause of a man deciding how to explain something he had not planned to explain. "The cottage is old," Ethan said. "Good bones, but old. I started noticing things when I came to stay." "You could have told me. You would have said everything was fine." Malcolm opened his mouth and closed it again, because this was accurate. "You know how to read buildings," he said. "I learned from watching you read everything else," Ethan said. "You always said, the thing that looks fine is not always the thing that is fine. You have to look past the surface." Malcolm turned that over in his mind. He had said that. He had said it to Ethan specifically, more than once, about wiring and about boats, and about the general principle of not trusting appearances, when a system's actual condition was the thing that mattered. "The roof," Malcolm said. 4 years ago, the flashing around the chimney. I walked past it every day. I know you did, but you were not looking for it. I was." Malcolm was quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen window, the slope of the garden was bright after the rain, the wet grass catching the late morning sun. The junction box on the north wall was new now, stainless steel, sealed properly, everything it should be. "The power point's in the kitchen," Malcolm said. 5 years ago. Before you moved in, honestly, I had been planning to mention it. Then you did the full check yourself when you arrived, and I thought, he will find them. But you were looking at the obvious connections, the ones you could see from the front. I should have opened them. Yes, but you were also moving your life into a new house 3 months after Grandma died, Granddad. You were doing approximately 47 other things. Malcolm was quiet again. The afternoon light was changing, the autumn sun moving in its particular arc across the Otago sky, the light that he loved most in this city, the quality it had in the middle of the day in April and May, something in the angle and the clarity that made every surface look more itself than usual. The rooftops below him, the chimney pots, the old stone buildings of North Dunedin working their way down toward the water. "You should have told me," Malcolm said. "I thought you would worry, or argue, or tell me you could handle it yourself." "I might have." "I know. You should have told me anyway." A silence on the line that was not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that two people who understand each other can share, without it meaning anything except that the words have run ahead and the feeling is still catching up. "I am going to come down at the weekend," Ethan said. "If the weather holds." "Weather will do what it does," Malcolm said. "Come anyway." After the call, he sat at the kitchen table with the folder in front of him and the cold coffee beside him, and he thought about what it meant to be taken care of. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life as the one who fixed things. He had fixed things for Margaret, and for Carol, and for the men he worked with, and for the neighbors who knocked on the door, and for anyone who stood near him with a problem he knew how to solve. He had built his understanding of his own worth around the capacity to identify what needed doing and to do it, and he had assumed, without examining the assumption, that this capacity was the most important thing he had to offer the people he loved. He had not spent much time considering what it meant to receive that kind of attention from someone else. He had not considered it because he had not known it was happening. It had been happening for 6 years. Malcolm Harrington, who read systems for a living, who could trace a fault through a wall in the dark, who had been called the most careful man in any crew he ever worked with, had been living in a house that his 23-year-old grandson had decided to watch over quietly, and he had not noticed a thing. He sat with that truth the way you sit with something that is both humbling and strangely beautiful, the way you sit with evidence that you are loved in a way that does not need you to know about it to be real. Ethan had not done any of this to be thanked. He had done it because the cottage was where his grandfather lived, and his grandfather mattered to him, and problems had to be fixed before they became disasters. Simple as that. The logic of someone who had learned to care by watching a man who cared and had come, in his own way and his own time, to do the same thing. The folder sat on the kitchen table. Outside, the afternoon moved across the harbor in its slow and golden way. Malcolm picked up his coffee, found it entirely cold, stood up and made another cup, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the north wall, where the new junction box sat clean and sealed and right, and he felt something that he was going to need the rest of the weekend to find a proper name for. Not only gratitude, not only love, something that included both of those, and also a species of wonder at the particular shape that care takes when it comes from someone who learned it honestly, who grew into it slowly, who chose it quietly, and who expected nothing back from it except the knowledge that the person they loved was safe. He turned on the kitchen light. It came on without a flicker. He stood in the light and let it hold him for a moment. Then he rinsed his cup and went to find his coat, because the afternoon was fine now, and the harbor would be beautiful, and he had some thinking to do, the kind that is best done walking, with the salt coming in off the water and the gulls keeping their own commentary overhead, and the old city arranged around you in all its familiar and imperfect and beloved detail. He locked the door behind him and went out into the afternoon, and the Royal Terrace fell away below him, toward the rooftops and the water, and the sun was on everything. Malcolm walked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, which was longer than his usual circuit and longer than his knees strictly approved of. But some days the body's objections are less important than what the mind needs, and what his mind needed that afternoon was distance and movement, and the particular clarity that comes from putting one foot in front of the other on familiar ground, while something large works itself out inside you. He went down through the streets of North Dunedin, past the university buildings with their gray stone faces and their long association with rain and serious thinking, past the houses that climbed the hillsides in their Victorian rows, the weatherboards painted in the colors that Dunedin favored, the creams and the dark greens, and the occasional terracotta that appeared like a warm thought in an otherwise cool conversation. He crossed toward the Botanic Garden and walked along the water of Leith for a stretch, the stream running high and quick from last night's rain, the willows at the bank trailing their fingers in the brown water. Then back up through the residential streets toward the ridge, taking the hill more slowly than he once would have, stopping once on the pretense of looking at the harbor view, which was genuine enough as pretenses go because the harbor from the upper streets in autumn light is something that rewards stopping for. The Otago harbor stretched out below him, long and silver gray under the clearing sky, the hills of the peninsula rising on the far side with that particular dark green that comes from bush and cloud together, and the water moving in its slow tidal way between the two shores, as it had been doing since long before anyone put a city beside it. He thought about his father on that hill. His father had been a man of the sea in the literal, working sense, a man who understood distance as something you measured in days and weeks rather than kilometers, who came home from long voyages with a particular quality of presence, the presence of a man for whom home was not a constant, but a destination, something you arrived at after genuine effort, and were therefore unable to take for granted. He had not been demonstrative. He had not talked about his feelings, which was not a failure of character, but a product of his time and his world, the same world that had shaped Malcolm. What he had done was show up. He had come back from every voyage. He had sat at the kitchen table on the morning after arriving home, and eaten his breakfast, and listened to his family with the full attention of someone who understood that attention was a form of love. He had fixed things around the house with a thoroughness that Malcolm now recognized as something more than practicality. He had maintained the fabric of the life they shared with the care of a man who understood that fabric does not maintain itself. Malcolm had learned to be a man partly by watching his father be one. Ethan had learned to be a man partly by watching Malcolm. The line ran through them like a vein of good ore through ordinary rock, not obvious from the surface, present and real when you cut deep enough. He made it back to Royal Terrace by 4 in the afternoon, changed his boots in the hallway and put the kettle on. The kitchen was ordinary and warm around him, the afternoon light coming in through the window above the sink at the angle it reached at this time of year, a warm, late slant that made the white paint of the sill glow a little. The new junction box on the north wall was invisible from inside, which was how it should be. The kitchen light was on. He had left it on when he went out, which was something he never usually did. A small, deliberate act that he could not entirely explain, but that felt necessary. He made his tea and sat at the table and opened the folder again and read through each document a second time, more slowly now, with the afternoon around him and the walking done, and the first shock of it settled into something more like understanding. He read the dates. He traced the sequence. He understood, reading it this way, that Ethan had not been working from a list or a plan, but from observation, that each item in the folder represented something Ethan had noticed during a visit, or from the monitoring system, or from some other channel of attention that Malcolm had not been tracking, and that each time something had been noticed, a response had been organized, quietly, completely, and without expectation of acknowledgement. There was something in the service record for the heat pump that caught his eye this time, a line he had passed over in his first reading. The technician's notes described the compressor fault and then added a secondary observation, that the filter in the unit had been cleaned recently and thoroughly, and that this kind of regular maintenance significantly extended the operational life of the system. Malcolm had not cleaned that filter. He cleaned many things in this house, but he had not, he was now certain, cleaned that particular filter, because he had told himself when Ethan installed the heat pump 2 years after Margaret died, that he would figure out the maintenance schedule, and he had not yet gotten to it. Ethan had been cleaning the filter on his visits. He must have been doing it since the unit was installed, slipping into the spare bedroom while Malcolm was in the garden, or at the shops, or simply in another room, doing the small, unglamorous maintenance that kept expensive equipment working, and saying nothing about it to anyone. Malcolm set the document down and looked out the window. He was not sure what he felt exactly. He was not angry. He understood why Ethan had not told him, understood it in the specific way you understand something that is true of yourself, the particular pride of a man who wants to manage his own home, who does not want to be the subject of arrangements made on his behalf, who would have argued or dismissed or insisted he had it handled. He understood that Ethan had weighed the cost of telling him against the cost of not telling him, and had made a calculation that was both loving and probably correct. He understood all of that. And still, sitting with the totality of it, 6 years of silent maintenance, 14 documented visits and interventions and replacements and repairs, a parallel history of care running alongside his own life without his knowledge. He felt the considerable weight of having been looked after without knowing it, and the complicated response that weight produced in a man who had spent his entire life being the one who looked after things. He thought about Margaret. She had understood him in the way that only comes from decades of genuine attention, the kind of understanding that is not instinctive but built, constructed carefully from thousands of small observations accumulated over years, the way coral builds from the slow deposit of countless small lives into something solid and permanent. She had understood that his need to be competent, to be the one who solved problems, was not arrogance but something older and more fundamental, a form of love that he expressed through function rather than words, because words had always been harder for him than action. She had worked around this tendency with the patient skill of a woman who loved him completely and also saw him clearly, which are two things that not everyone manages to hold at the same time. She had let him fix things. She had thanked him for the fixing, and she had quietly arranged what she needed to arrange when the thing that needed arranging was beyond him or beside him, and she had not made him feel diminished by it. Ethan had learned something from her too, Malcolm thought, more than he had known. Let me ask you something here, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. When was the last time you let someone take care of you? Not dramatically, not in a crisis, just in the ordinary, daily, small way that people who love each other look after one another. Write it in the comments. I mean it. And tell me where you are listening from, because this story has reached people in places I never expected, and every comment that arrives is something I read with real attention. Subscribe if you have not. Leave a like if what I'm saying is finding something in you that needs finding. There is a new story here every single day, and each one carries something genuine inside it. Let me go on. The weekend arrived with better weather than the week had promised. Saturday morning came in clear and cool. The sky over the harbor the color of old pewter shading toward silver, the sun making its way up over the hills with the unhurried authority of October, giving way to something warmer. Malcolm was up at 6 as always, coffee made, the radio on low, and he had cleaned the kitchen more thoroughly than usual, in a way he would not have examined closely if asked, straightening the things on the counter, wiping the surfaces, setting out the good cups rather than the ordinary ones. Ethan was coming at 11. He arrived at 11:15 in his work ute, the white one with the company name on the door that Malcolm privately thought was too loud an advertisement for a young man who let his work speak for itself. But that was a preference Malcolm kept to himself. Ethan was taller than Malcolm remembered each time, which was an optical illusion created by the fact that Malcolm was developing the slight stoop of a man in his mid-70s, and Ethan stood up very straight, a professional habit from years of assessing buildings and needing to see things accurately. He had his mother's coloring, the dark hair and the blue eyes that had come through Carol from Margaret's side, and he had something around the mouth that was purely his own, a particular quality of expression, a kind of considered steadiness that seemed to Malcolm to be what reserve looks like when it comes from confidence rather than shyness. They embraced in the front doorway, briefly, in the way of men of both their temperaments, a genuine thing expressed without theater, and then Ethan set his bag in the hall, and they went to the kitchen and Malcolm put the kettle on again. They talked easily, as they always did, moving between the practical and the personal in the way of people who have known each other long enough not to need a warm-up period. Ethan described the Middlemarch job, a heritage farmhouse with a foundation issue that the owners had been attributing to the wrong cause for 2 years, and that a morning with Ethan had correctly identified and documented. He talked about the drive back, the Strathtyre Road in the storm, the patchy coverage on the hill above the city, the moment the notification came through on his phone, and the particular quality of worry that had settled on him as he pulled over in the dark and looked at the camera feed. Malcolm listened. He let Ethan tell it fully, the way the story wanted to be told, from the notification forward. Then he was quiet for a moment and said, "I found the folder." Ethan looked at his tea. "I found all of it," Malcolm said. "The roof, the power points, the plumber under the floor in the bathroom, the heat pump filter." A pause. Not a guilty pause. Something more considered than guilt. "I was going to tell you," Ethan said, "when it seemed right." "When was that going to be?" Ethan looked up. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Maybe when you were old enough that I thought you would not argue about it. I'm 76. You are the most argumentative 76-year-old I have ever met." Malcolm made a sound that was somewhere between a short laugh and a grunt of acknowledgement, because this was accurate. "The roof," he said. 4 years ago. I walked past the chimney every day." "I know you did." "I should have seen the flashing." "You were not looking for it. You had other things. It was 3 months after Grandma died. You were not looking at chimney flashing." Malcolm was quiet. The kitchen held them, warm and ordinary, the light through the window above the sink making its familiar late-morning angle across the counter. The folder was still on the table where he had left it. He had not put it away. "You could have told me and let me decide," Malcolm said. "Yes," Ethan said. "I could have done that." "Why did you not?" Ethan was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was choosing words seriously. "Because I knew what you would have said. Everything is fine. I have been maintaining this house for 30 years. I know what I am looking at. And you would have believed it, because you needed to believe it. Because this house is yours and hers, and taking care of it was how you stayed close to her after she went." The kitchen was very quiet. Malcolm looked at the folder on the table. He looked at the window, the garden on the slope, the wet grass still bright from the week's rain. "That is a very accurate thing to say," he said, after a moment. "I know," Ethan said. "I'm sorry if it is too much." "No," Malcolm said. "It is the right amount." Let me pause here because I think this is the moment this story is really about, and I want you to sit in it with me for just a few seconds before I go on. The right amount. A man knowing someone well enough to understand not just what they need to hear, but how much of the truth they can hold at once. That is a kind of love that takes years to develop. It takes patience and attention, and a willingness to see someone clearly, even when seeing them clearly is difficult. If you have ever been understood that way, truly understood, write it in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from right now. Tell me who understood you. And subscribe if you are not yet subscribed, because tomorrow's story is building from this same place, this same belief that the quietest things carry the most weight. Leave a like. I mean it. They had lunch together at the kitchen table, soup that Malcolm had made that morning from the leek and potato that he kept on hand through the cooler months, eaten with bread from the bakery on George Street that Ethan had brought with him. And they talked through the afternoon about the things they always talked about when they had time: the harbor, the buildings, the state of the city's Victorian infrastructure, and what it would take to preserve it properly, which was a subject on which Ethan had professional opinions, and Malcolm had personal ones, and the overlap between them was considerable. They talked about Carol, who was living in Nelson now and doing well in the way that cautious parents mean when they say doing well, which is that the visible signs are positive and the invisible ones are not their business. They talked about a fishing trip they had been planning loosely for 2 summers and had not yet managed to organize into anything actual, and they agreed that this summer they would make it actual. Malcolm did not say everything that was in him to say about the folder. He said some of it, enough to be honest, enough so that Ethan understood it had been received in the spirit it was meant. The rest of it he kept in the way that men of his nature keep things, folded carefully and placed somewhere internal, where it was accessible to him but not on display. He knew what the folder meant. He knew what 6 years of quiet maintenance meant. He did not need to perform the knowing in order for it to be real. What he did say at the end of the afternoon when Ethan was rinsing the cups and Malcolm was watching the harbor go bronze in the late sun was this: "Your grandmother would have found a way to tell you." Ethan turned to look at him. "She would have found the right moment and the right words, and she would have said it properly. She was better at that than I am." He paused. "But I want you to know that I understand what you have done, not just the practical side of it, all of it. And I am grateful. In whatever way I am able to be grateful, which I acknowledge is not always the most visible way." Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I know that, Granddad." "Good," Malcolm said. "Then we understand each other." "We always have," Ethan said. The harbor below them was bronze and silver in the late afternoon, the light going the way it goes in Dunedin in the middle of the year, slowly, with a kind of reluctance, as if the day is not quite ready to concede. Malcolm watched it and felt the day settle around him in the way good days settle, without drama, with a kind of natural rightness that you recognize only in retrospect, when you look back on a day and understand that it was one of the ones that mattered. 3 weeks after the storm, Malcolm drove himself to a hardware supply store in South Dunedin and spent an hour and a half in the timber section, making decisions he had not made in a while, running his hands along grain and weight and density with the practiced judgment of a man who had worked with materials his whole life and knew how to read what a piece of wood was telling him. He was looking for something specific, not in terms of a product on a shelf, but in terms of quality, density of grain, straightness, the absence of the small knots and inclusions that compromise the long-term durability of a material you intend to use for something that should outlast you. He came home with 3 lengths of native timber and a bag of hardware, and a new set of chisels that he had not strictly needed, but that presented themselves as both fine and reasonably priced, and that he was not able to walk past with a clear conscience. He had not told Ethan what he was planning. He had made the decision alone at the kitchen table one morning, about a week after the weekend visit, sitting with his coffee in the early light and looking at the light fitting above the table. The original fitting that had been in the cottage when he bought it, a simple pressed metal pendant of the kind that had been standard in New Zealand homes of a certain era, functional and not unpleasant, but not something anyone had chosen for any reason beyond convention. He looked at it for a long time. Then, he made his decision. He was going to make a new one. He had not done fine woodwork in some years, not since the period after Margaret died, when he had made several things in the workshop as a way of moving through the days: a small cabinet for Carol, a set of shelves for the spare bedroom, a bread box that he had not needed, and that was now in the kitchen doing exactly what a bread box does with a quiet competence he found satisfying. The workshop was at the back of the property, a corrugated iron shed that he had insulated and fitted with good lighting, and a bench that ran the full length of the back wall, and it held his tools in the organized way of a man who believed that a tool in its right place is a form of respect for the tool. He had not been out there much this year. The timber would change that. He spent the first week on design, which for Malcolm meant sketches on the back of envelopes and several sessions standing in the kitchen, looking at the ceiling and the table and the window, and the way the light moved through the room at different times of day. He wanted something warm, something with weight to it, something that looked as if it belonged in this kitchen, rather than having been placed there by someone who shopped online. He wanted it to be a thing made with care from materials chosen carefully, because the meaning of the object mattered to him, and the meaning required that the making be honest. He thought about the folder on the table. He thought about what it represented, not just the practical repairs, but the entire posture of care that had produced them. The decision made by a 23-year-old to pay attention to something and to keep paying attention year after year without announcement or acknowledgement. He thought about what it meant to love someone through function, to say I care about you through the language of maintenance and repair and the quiet prevention of harm. He understood that language because he had spoken it his whole life without knowing it had a name. He had expressed love through fixing things for the people he loved, and he had not understood until this week that his grandson had looked at him, had watched him speak that language for 20-odd years, and had learned it, had taken it in and made it his own, and turned it back toward Malcolm himself without asking for permission or expecting anything back. The pendant light was going to be his reply, not in words, not in a conversation that would have embarrassed them both, in the language they actually shared. If you have ever made something with your hands for someone you love, you will understand what I mean when I say that the making itself is part of the gift, not just the object at the end of it. The hours you spend with the material, the decisions about grain and joint and proportion, the small corrections along the way, the patience required to do it properly rather than quickly. All of that is the making talking. All of that is part of what you are giving. Tell me in the comments if you have done this. Tell me what you made and who it was for. Tell me where you are listening from and what time it is there. And subscribe, because what is coming in the next few minutes of this story is the thing I have been working towards since the first sentence. Leave a like. Stay with me. He worked on it through November, an hour in the morning before the day claimed him, sometimes 2 hours on weekend mornings when there was no particular reason to hurry. He worked without pressure, which was important, because pressure produces a different kind of object than patience does. He shaped the main body of the pendant from the densest of the 3 pieces of timber he had selected, a piece with a grain so fine and even that it had taken the first round of sanding, like a conversation rather than a contest. He built the canopy from the second piece, cutting and fitting the join with a care that reminded him pleasantly of the fine joinery work he had done on a boat restoration in the late 1980s, a wooden vessel with a mahogany interior that had required exactly this kind of patient attention to the relationship between 2 surfaces. He ran the cable channel through the body of the pendant with a bit that left the inside of the channel smooth and clean, the way a good tool in good hands should leave things. He thought, while he worked, about the cottage and its history. He thought about all the hands that had worked on it before his, The builders who had first put it up in the early years of the previous century, the various owners who had lived in it and maintained it and modified it over the decades, the tradesmen who had added the wiring and the plumbing and the heating as those systems became standard expectations rather than luxuries. He thought about himself, arriving here 7 years ago with Margaret's loss still raw in him, and the house needing more work than he had admitted to anyone, and the particular fierce satisfaction of restoring it, of making it right, of bringing it up to the standard that he believed a home should meet. He thought about the 14 documents in the folder. He thought about the junction box on the north wall, sealed now against every storm the Otago coast could deliver. He thought about what it means to protect a place where someone you love lives, and what it means to be the one who is protected. Ethan came back in the second weekend of December for what they were calling the fishing trip planning visit, which in practice meant an afternoon with a map and 2 people who wanted to fish, but were better at talking about fishing than organizing it, followed by a large meal that Malcolm had cooked with the particular thoroughness he brought to cooking for company. It was warm by then, the Dunedin summer settling in with its characteristic modesty, not the aggressive heat of the North Island, but a gentle and generous warmth that suited the city and the harbor and the hills and seemed native to them. They sat in the garden after the meal, the evening light long and golden over the rooftops below them, with tea and a plate of biscuits that Malcolm had bought from the same bakery on George Street, and was not going to admit he had bought specifically because Ethan liked them. Malcolm had not told him about the workshop project. He had been deliberate about this. He wanted it finished before it was discussed, wanted it to exist as a complete object before it became a conversation, because the conversation would be easier once the thing was real. He had finished the pendant 3 days before Ethan's visit, fitting the final hardware and running the cable and testing the connection in the workshop before he installed it, because he was not going to install something in his own kitchen that he had not tested properly, regardless of his confidence in his own work. It had lit up without a flicker, warm and steady, the timber glowing at the join between the canopy and the body with the quality that good wood and good oil and good light produce together, something that looks both new and as if it has always been there. He had installed it on the Thursday evening, replacing the old, pressed metal fitting efficiently and without ceremony, checking the connection twice and the fitting once, and standing back at the kitchen table to assess the result. It was right, not flashy, not dramatic. Right. The kind of right that comes from decisions made with care at every stage of the process, from the choice of timber through the final fitting. The kind of right that would outlast him, which was what he had intended. He had turned on the kitchen light. It had filled the room with the particular warmth of incandescent light through timber, a quality he had not planned but that the wood had produced on its own, as if it had always known what it was for. The kitchen looked like itself, only more so. The table, the window, the worn surfaces that held 40 years of meals and conversations, and the slow accumulation of a life. The light held it all. He had stood there for a long time. That evening in the garden, when the tea was done and the biscuits were finished and the light was going its slow Dunedin way toward the long summer dusk, Malcolm said to Ethan, "Come inside. I want to show you something." He turned on the kitchen light. Ethan stood in the doorway and looked at the pendant for a moment without speaking. He looked at it the way he looked at buildings, with the particular professional attention of someone who knows how to read what a structure is telling him about the decisions that made it. Then he looked at Malcolm. "You made that," he said, "in the workshop. Took me most of November." Ethan looked at it again. He stepped into the kitchen and stood under it, looking up at the grain of the timber in the light, the join of the canopy, the curve of the main body. He reached up and touched the surface of it with the back of his fingers, lightly, the way you touch something you want to understand without disturbing. "The timber is from South Dunedin," Malcolm said. "I took a while choosing it." "I can see that," Ethan said quietly. They stood together in the kitchen under the light for a moment. The harbor was bronze below them in the evening light, and the city was going about its quiet business, and the old cottage held them both in the particular way that a well-made and honestly maintained house holds the people inside it, warmly, solidly, with the structural confidence of something built to last. Malcolm said, "I owed you a reply." Ethan looked at him. "You have been looking after this place for 6 years without telling me, and I do not have the words for what that means, so I made this instead." He paused. "I thought we could do the final fitting together. There is a junction piece that I left unfinished on purpose, so that there would be a thing you put in too." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When?" "Whenever you like," Malcolm said. "No rush. The light works as it is." Ethan nodded. He looked at the pendant once more, at the grain and the warmth and the care that was visible in it to anyone who knew how to look. "Next time," he said. "Weekend after the New Year." "Suits me," Malcolm said. They ate the leftover rice from the meal cold out of the pot at the kitchen table while it got dark outside, the way men who are comfortable together eat when formality has run its course, and what remains is just the pleasure of company. And they talked about the fishing trip until it became something almost organized, something with dates attached and a location decided upon, and Malcolm felt the evening settle around him, the way good evenings settle, with a completeness that needs nothing added. Let me stop here one more time, because we are coming into the final stretch of this story, and I want to make sure you are ready for it. Not because what is coming is dramatic, quite the opposite. What is coming is quiet. It is the quietest thing. And sometimes the quietest things require the most preparation. Tell me where you are listening from right now. Tell me what time it is there. Tell me if you have been making something for someone, or if someone has been quietly keeping something safe for you without your knowing. Leave a comment. Leave a like. Subscribe if you are not yet subscribed, because tomorrow I will be here again with another one, and the one after that, every single day. And share this one, because somewhere out there right now, there is someone who needs to hear a story about a man who was looked after without knowing it, and who found a way to say thank you in the only language he was fluent in. That person needs to hear this tonight. Help me find them. The New Year came to Dunedin the way it always does, without particular announcement, the harbor looking the same on the 2nd of January as it had on the 31st of December, the hills unchanged, the gulls conducting their usual business over the water with the professional indifference of creatures for whom the calendar is irrelevant. Malcolm had watched the New Year arrive from the upper window of the cottage, the city below him lit in a modest way, because Dunedin is not a city that makes excessive noise about transitions, and he had felt the familiar quality of a new year settling around him, not the artificial fresh start that January promises and rarely delivers, but the subtler truth of continuity, the sense that you are the same person you were the night before, and that this is, on balance, a good thing, that the life you have built is the life you are living, and the living of it is what matters. He had thought about Ethan. He had thought about the folder still sitting in the spare bedroom in the filing drawer, where he had returned it after reading it 3 times and understanding it as fully as he was going to understand it. He had thought about the pendant above the kitchen table, the way it held the room in its particular warmth each evening when he turned it on, the grain of the timber visible in the light, the junction at the canopy that he had left unfinished with a deliberateness that still satisfied him, a thing with a piece missing that the right person would complete. He had thought about that. He had also thought, on the first morning of the New Year, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and the radio on low, about what it means to be grateful. Not the performance of gratitude, the words and the gestures and the social obligation of it, but the real thing, the interior thing, the shift in understanding that happens when you have received something you did not know you needed and cannot fully account for. He had been turning it over for weeks, the way he turned problems over when he was tracing a fault, coming at it from different angles, looking for the place where the understanding would seat properly and hold. And sitting at the kitchen table on the first morning of the New Year, with the harbor below him and the light coming in through the window above the sink, he thought he had found it. Gratitude, the real kind, is not a feeling you have about what someone has done. It is a feeling you have about who someone is. What Ethan had done, the 14 interventions documented in the folder, the years of quiet maintenance and silent care, those were the expression of something. They were the language in which a particular kind of person speaks a particular kind of love. And what Malcolm was grateful for was not the fixed roof, or the replaced power points, or the sealed junction box, though he was grateful for those too, practically and genuinely. What he was grateful for was that this was the person his grandson had become, that the young man who had followed him around this cottage asking questions about wiring had grown into someone who understood that asking questions is only the beginning, that understanding is only the beginning, that what you do with the understanding is the measure of you. He had been teaching Ethan that his whole life, without knowing he was teaching it, and Ethan had learned it better than Malcolm had. That was the thing sitting at the bottom of all of it, the thing he had been working toward for weeks without quite reaching it. His grandson had learned from him and surpassed him, had taken what Malcolm had shown him, the commitment to maintenance, the refusal to look away from a problem, the belief that the people you love deserve the best quality of attention you can give, and had applied it with a consistency and a patience and a selflessness that Malcolm, honest with himself on the first morning of a new year, was not sure he had always managed. He was proud of this in the deepest way he knew how to be proud, the way that sits below the words and the gestures and lives in the bone, the wordless certainty that something you were part of making has turned out to be genuinely good. He finished his coffee and rinsed the cup and stood at the window for a while, looking at the harbor, and then he put on his coat and went for his walk. Let me stop here for a moment, because I want to ask you something before we go any further into this final chapter. I've been telling you this story for a while now, and I hope it has been finding something in you that needed finding. But here is what I want to know. I want to know if you have ever had a moment like the one I just described to you, a moment where you understood something about someone you love that changed the way you saw your whole history together. Not a dramatic revelation, just a quiet settling into place of something that had been there all along, but that you had not quite been able to see from where you were standing. Write it in the comments. Write it however it comes. A sentence, a paragraph, a name. I read every one, and I mean that without qualification. Tell me where you are listening from and what time it is there. Tell me if it is cold where you are, or warm. Tell me if you are alone or if someone is in the next room. Subscribe if you have not yet, because what is coming in the last part of this story is the thing I most want you to carry with you when it is done. Leave a like, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it tonight, because I think you probably know who that person is. Ethan arrived on the second Saturday of January at 10:30 in the morning, later than he had said, which was unlike him. But he had called ahead to explain that he had stopped at a place in Milton on the drive down, because he had seen something he thought Malcolm would want to look at, an old commercial building that was being considered for heritage listing, and that had a structural problem visible from the street that no one seemed to have identified yet, and he had stopped to look properly and write a note to the relevant authority. Malcolm had laughed when Ethan told him this on the phone, because it was so completely like him. The inability to drive past a building that needed looking at, the compulsion to document what he saw and send it to whoever needed to know, the absolute assumption that noticing a problem obligated you to act on it. Malcolm recognized this quality completely because he had spent 40 years being unable to drive past an electrical fault without doing something about it, and the recognition had a warmth in it that no amount of self-awareness could diminish. They had breakfast together at the kitchen table, eggs that Malcolm had made in the cast-iron pan that had been in the kitchen since he and Margaret had first set up house, a pan so seasoned and so broken in over decades of use that it produced eggs with a quality of easy perfection that new cookware could not approach. They ate with the easy silence of people who do not require conversation to be comfortable together, the harbor visible below in the summer morning light, a small yacht working its way out toward the heads against a modest breeze, the hills of the peninsula dark green and clear in the warm air. After breakfast, Malcolm said, "Workshop?" Ethan pushed back from the table. Right. They went out through the back garden, down the slope past the vegetable beds that Malcolm maintained with a seriousness of purpose that would have surprised anyone who associated gardens only with leisure, to the corrugated iron shed at the property's lower edge. Malcolm unlocked the padlock and swung the door, and the workshop smell came out to meet them. The good compound of timber dust and linseed oil, and the particular mineral clarity of metal tools kept clean and dry, a smell that Malcolm associated with the best parts of his own character, the patient parts, the parts that believed good work was worth the time it took. He had the junction piece on the bench, finished to the point where it was ready to seat, but not yet seated, a small curved section of timber that completed the canopy of the pendant, at the point where it met the cable entry, the piece he had left out deliberately. He had made two versions of it, identical in dimension and finish, because he had wanted to give Ethan a choice, even in something this small. They were on the bench side by side, and he indicated them without explanation. Ethan picked up the first one, turned it over, ran his thumb along the grain. He set it down and picked up the second, did the same. He looked at Malcolm. "This one," he said, holding up the second. "The grain runs a better line through the join." "That is what I thought too," Malcolm said. "I made both because I was not sure which one you would choose." "You made both," Ethan said, "so that I would actually have a choice." "Yes," Malcolm said. Ethan looked at him. Something moved across his face that Malcolm did not try to name. Then he said, "All right, show me what needs to be done." Malcolm showed him. The fitting was straightforward, the kind of work that rewards care rather than demanding it, a matter of alignment and a single fixing, and the patient hand that does not rush the final seat of a joint that needs to settle into its position without force. Ethan worked with the ease of someone who used his hands professionally, and who had also grown up watching a man who believed in doing things properly, and the piece went in cleanly and without drama, the way good fittings go when everything has been prepared correctly. They stood together in the workshop and looked at the completed piece, the pendant whole now, the canopy finished, the join Malcolm had made, and the piece Ethan had seated together forming a continuous surface that showed nothing of the seam unless you looked for it. "Good," Malcolm said. "Yes," Ethan said. They carried it back up the slope to the kitchen, where Malcolm had already run the cable and prepared the ceiling rows, and they fitted it together, working in the particular easy coordination of two people who think similarly about problems and who do not need to explain themselves to each other in the middle of a practical task. Malcolm made the electrical connections himself, because some things you do yourself not out of pride, but out of the respect you owe to 40 years of learning how to do them correctly. He tested the connection before they closed the canopy. Everything was right. He closed the canopy and they stepped back. Malcolm turned on the kitchen light. The pendant came on with the same warm steadiness it had shown in the workshop, the timber glowing at the join, the light spreading across the kitchen table and the worn surfaces with the quality of something that belonged there completely. The piece Ethan had seated was invisible in the finished surface. This was as it should be. The best work is invisible. The best maintenance is invisible. The best care is invisible until the moment it is needed, and then it is the only thing standing between you and the dark. They stood in the kitchen under the light Malcolm had made, and the piece Ethan had completed, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because what was there was already fully said, was contained in the object above them, and the morning around them, and the years behind them, and the particular quality of a silence shared between two people who understand each other as well as two people who love each other, and are not afraid of it, can understand each other. Then Malcolm said, "Tea." And Ethan said, "Please." And they sat at the table under the light and drank their tea and watched the harbor. I want to stop here one more time before I tell you the end of this, not because there is drama to prepare you for, because there is not. What is coming is the opposite of drama. It is the small thing, the ordinary thing, the thing that happens in kitchens and workshops and gardens, and in the cab of trucks pulled over on the side of a hill in a storm at 2 in the morning, when the signal is barely enough to carry a single sentence, and the sentence carries everything. I want to make sure you are ready for ordinary things before I give them to you, because ordinary things are the ones that last. So tell me where you are right now. Tell me what time it is. Tell me if someone is near you, or if you are alone. And if this story has been giving you something you needed, I want you to subscribe if you have not already, because tomorrow I will be here with another one, and the one after that, every single day without exception. Leave a like. It is a small thing and it matters more than you might think. And share this one. Send it to the person in your life who fixes things quietly without saying anything about it. Send it to the person who was looked after without knowing it. Send it to the person who needs to hear tonight that the smallest acts of care are the ones that hold the world together. The summer moved through Dunedin in its characteristically modest way, warm enough to enjoy and never so warm as to impose, the kind of summer that invites you to be outside without demanding it, that makes the harbor beautiful in the evenings without theatrics, that lets the city be itself in the long light. Malcolm and Ethan had their fishing trip in late January, 2 days on the Clutha River system north of Balclutha, staying in a small hired cottage that smelled of river damp and old carpet and that suited both of them entirely, cooking their own meals and fishing with the steady, unhurried patience of men, for whom the fish are genuinely secondary to the river and the silence and the quality of being in a place that requires nothing of you except to be present in it. They caught several trout and released most of them. They had long conversations about subjects that interested them both: the structural heritage of Central Otago, the electrical systems of wooden vessels, the particular problem of maintaining the physical fabric of a country that tends to build in timber, and then be surprised when timber requires attention. They had no conversations about the folder, or the pendant, or the night of the storm, because those things had been said in the way they were equipped to say them, and did not need saying again. The understanding between them was complete, had been complete since the January morning in the kitchen, with the tea going cold beside them, and the harbor below and the light above that had been made by one and finished by the other. Malcolm turned 68 years old on the river, and Ethan made him a birthday breakfast of a seriousness that somewhat exceeded the occasion: eggs and bacon and toast, and a small cake from a bakery in Balclutha that Ethan had detoured to purchase the previous afternoon without mentioning it, and Malcolm ate it at the table by the cottage window with the river sounds coming through the screen, and felt the particular pleasure of a birthday that asks nothing of you except to be in it. 77 next year, Ethan said. I am aware, Malcolm said. Any thoughts about turning 77? Yes. Malcolm considered this seriously, because Ethan had asked it seriously. I think about the same thoughts I've had about every year since I turned 70, he said. That the number is less important than the quality of what fills it. That the quality of what fills it is largely a matter of who you spend it with and what you pay attention to. And that I have been, on balance, fortunate in both. Ethan looked at him. That is a good answer. It is the true answer, Malcolm said, which is usually the same thing. They fished through the afternoon and came back in the early evening to cook the 2 trout they had kept, which Malcolm prepared simply in the pan with butter and lemon, the way his father had taught him, and the way he had taught Carol, and the way he now understood Ethan knew, because Ethan's preparation of the fish had the ease of something long practiced rather than recently learned, and Malcolm had watched him and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing passing correctly down through the people who carry it. He drove home the following afternoon through the golden late summer light of South Otago, the long, straight roads through the farming land, with the Clutha somewhere to his right and the sky enormous above the flat paddocks and the occasional stand of macrocarpa breaking the horizon. He drove with the window down because the air was warm and clean and smelled of grass and distant water, and he drove with the particular contentment of a man returning to a place he has chosen and loves, the contentment that is different from happiness, in that it is quieter and more durable, less dependent on circumstance, and more rooted in the accumulated decisions of a life that has been, with full acknowledgement of its difficulties and its losses, a good one. He turned onto Royal Terrace in the late afternoon, and parked and sat in the ute for a moment, looking at the cottage. It looked the same as it always looked, the weatherboards freshly painted, the garden on the slope in good order, the chimney solid against the late sky. It looked like a house that was being maintained properly, and Malcolm sat in the ute and understood for the first time the full meaning of that word, maintained, what it actually contains, the ongoing choice to attend, the refusal to let time do its patient damage unchallenged, the love that expresses itself through the physical fabric of a place, because some people have no other language for it, or need no other language, because the physical language says everything. He went inside and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the slope while the water heated. The evening was coming in off the harbor in that slow, golden way it had in late summer, the light thickening toward amber, the shadows of the garden lengthening across the grass. He turned on the kitchen light. The pendant came on above him, the timber warm in the light, the grain of it catching and holding the evening glow and giving it back to the kitchen in a quality that was partly the material and partly the making and partly the piece that had been seated by Ethan's hand on a January morning, while the harbor watched and the tea went cold. Malcolm stood in that light for a moment and looked at it and felt, with the completeness that takes a long time to arrive, everything that needed to be felt. Then he made his tea and sat at the table and turned his face toward the window and the evening, and the cottage held him, as it always did, solidly and warmly, and with the structural confidence of something built to last by people who understood that the building of things worth keeping is one of the few ways available to us to speak honestly about what we love. Every evening after that, when Malcolm turned on the kitchen light, he remembered the same things, not in a way that hurt, but in a way that was part of the pleasure of the moment, the way certain memories become so integrated into the texture of ordinary life that they are not recalled so much as present, always available in the background of a gesture, or a sound, or a quality of light. He remembered the phone shuddering against the bedside table at 3:02. He remembered Ethan's voice, careful and deliberate. One sentence. The sentence that was its own kind of love letter. The sentence that said, "I know where you live and I have been paying attention, and I am not going to let anything happen to you." He remembered the folder on the kitchen table and the slow accumulation of documents that had been, in their way, a different kind of love letter, written over 6 years in the language of maintenance invoices and service records, and the quiet decisions of a young man who had looked at an old man's house and understood that love requires action, and that action requires attention, and that attention requires the willingness to see what is actually there, rather than what you would prefer to see. He remembered the timber in his hands in the workshop through November, the grain reading itself to him the way materials always had, the patient work of making something that would outlast him, the small unfilled piece left deliberately for the right hands to complete. He remembered Ethan's thumb along the grain of the second piece, the choice made with the ease of someone who trusted his own eye, the fitting seated cleanly and without force, the pendant whole. He remembered his father coming home from the sea. He remembered Margaret at the window above the sink on Sunday mornings, the bread, the radio, the light. He remembered Terry in the Port Chalmers yard, and the lesson about looking when someone who knows things tells you something is wrong. He remembered himself at 23, beginning to understand what a man's life could be made of if he chose the right things to make it from. And every evening, in the kitchen of the cottage on Royal Terrace, with the harbor below and the hills beyond, and the city going about its quiet Dunedin business, he turned on the kitchen light and it came on warm and steady and right, as it always did now, and he stood in it for a moment before he got on with his evening, and he was grateful, in the deep and wordless way that is the only honest way to be grateful, for the person his grandson had become, and for the light above him, and for all of it, the whole long making of it. Now, I want to speak to you directly, not as the narrator of a story, but as a voice in your ear, wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, whatever you came to this story carrying. We live in a world that celebrates the loud, the dramatic, the visible, the gesture made in public, the help offered where it can be seen, the love spoken in front of witnesses. And there is nothing wrong with any of that. But the love that actually holds lives together, the love that has been holding your life together without your knowledge, is often the quiet kind. It is the phone call at 3 a.m. to say, "Do not turn on the kitchen light." It is the folder in the drawer. It is the filter cleaned on an afternoon when you were in the garden. It is the roof sealed before the water gets in. It is the flashing checked and mended before the damage becomes visible. It is the parent who stayed up, the friend who asked the right question, the person who drove through the storm to get you home, and who told no one about it afterward, because telling was not the point. This is the truth that this story has been carrying from the first sentence. The people who love us most are often the ones we know least about, not because they are hiding, but because love, real love, does not require a witness. It requires a person who needs something and someone who notices and acts. That is all. That is the whole of it. Pay attention to the quiet ones in your life, the ones who are always there when you need them and never there making a speech about it, the ones who fixed the thing before you knew it was broken, the ones who said the careful sentence at the right moment, the ones who drove through the storm, the ones who kept the folder. Pay attention to them, and when you can, tell them. Tell them in whatever language is yours. In words, if words come easy to you, in a phone call, in a meal cooked properly, in a thing made with your hands, in a piece seated in a pendant on a January morning in a kitchen where the light is warm and the harbor is below, and there is tea going cold on the table, and everything is understood between you without requiring another word. There is also this: if you are the quiet one, the one who maintains things in silence, the one who keeps the folder and fixes the roof and answers the call without making it about you, I want you to hear something. What you do is seen. Maybe not always in the moment, maybe not for years, but it is seen. It is known. It sits in the people you love in a way that changes them, that shapes them, that becomes the thing they teach to the next person who is watching and learning and growing into who they are. You are not invisible. You are the structure. You are the foundation. You are the reason the thing is still standing. Do not stop. And if you can, let one person tell you thank you. Let it land. It is not weakness to receive what you have earned. And if you are looking at someone in your life, someone who has been quietly doing this kind of work for you without your knowing, today is the day to tell them. Not next week, not when you find the right words. Today, you